Hello, this is Michael with Church Brain Guide. Welcome to the Church Brain Guide podcast. In this episode, we are talking about announcements. How do we do announcements really well at our church? This is one of those things where if you're a communications director, this is underneath you, and you're probably responsible for helping people understand what's going on at the church. And one of the great tools we have is doing announcements. So we'll unpack that here in just a moment. Before we do, let me set up this podcast. Basically, this podcast, the Church Brain Guide podcast, exists to help you cut through the noise and reach people you are pursuing in your community. We say it like this: we want to help you reach more people, see more people show up at your church, get more people to experience the life change that God has for them through the ministry of your church, and get more people to then buy into the vision that God has given you. So we give you tips and show you some great tools to help you do that really well. I came up as a communications director in a church, and a large church, also smaller churches, and I want to help you to get further faster than I did by sharing with you all the different tips I have that I've learned over the years to help you do this really, really well. So, if you're a pastor and you are wearing all the hats, this is going to help you. If you are somebody that's volunteering at your church to do this role, communications, which includes digital communication tools like your social media or your website, it includes maybe printed pieces like signage or flyers, but it also includes maybe verbal communication things such as announcements. I just want to help you understand how to do this really well so you can win. Ultimately, the kingdom gets to win because people are able to take next steps within your church. I truly believe the local church is the hope of the world, so I want to help you succeed. In this episode, like we talked about, we're talking to Joshua Riggs. He's our special guest. Joshua has been doing this for a long time, where he's doing communications on various levels at his church. He also has a business and a great resource he provides for churches. So he really knows what he's talking about. So him and I have this great conversation. It's actually a lot of great information. I separated it out into two episodes. So this will be part one, and again, both episodes are dealing with how do we do announcements really well. It's kind of the stepchild of church experience. Like, we kind of think about it as a kind of a second thought, but how do we do that really well? So let's get into this episode with Joshua Riggs as we talk about doing announcement at your church. Welcome to our podcast today. I'm here with Joshua Riggs, and we're going to jump into a great topic of announcements. Hey, Joshua, how's it going?
Good. How are you doing, Michael?
All right, I'm doing well. So, a
Awesome.
funny story. I had a church I was working with, and they were doing announcements, and they had a lot of announcements, and it was almost overwhelming how many things they were trying to announce. And they had a bulletin, they had screens, they had a website page they were trying to point people to, a QR code, a whole bunch of stuff going on. I was like, this is a
Social
perfect
media.
job for, yes, social
Yeah.
media.
Uh-huh.
So I was like, this is a perfect job for Joshua. So uh, thanks for coming on and helping us out today with how do we do announcements really well so that this stuff sticks and people take action. Why don't you take a moment and just introduce yourself a little bit and some of your background?
Yeah. So first I want to say thank you, Michael, for the content and all the stuff you do to help the local church. I have learned so much from you, and I have, without even telling you, I have taken some of the stuff that I've learned from you and taught it to other churches, especially about branding and marketing. And so I appreciate all the work that you do, and how you help to resource the church with like podcasts like this and other resources. And so if you're not
Wow,
following,
thank you.
if you're not to
Yes.
subscribe, like, subscribe now. Now's the time to subscribe. Click the like and subscribe to this podcast wherever you're watching it on, or listening to. But so my name's Joshua Riggs. I am the worship pastor at Bethany Church in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. It's just a little south of Tulsa. I also am the creator of worshipresources.church. A lot of churches struggle to use tech the way it was meant to be used. And so I provide training and resources for churches so they can use the best software, the best technology to help their church get better. I'm married to Allison. We've been married for 19 years. We have five children, and the oldest is 17, the youngest is 4, and they are a huge part of our lives, a huge joy. And so yeah, I am excited to talk with you guys about announcements, the stepchild of church services, right?
That is a great way to put it. That's so good. I think a lot of churches struggle with this. So this is going to be super helpful. Before we got on our call today, Joshua and I were going through some notes and we realized, you know what, there's a lot here. We're going to actually break it up into 2 different episodes because it's really good. And so the first part, we're going to tackle the mindset really of announcements. And then in the second part, we'll come back with some more tactical type of things. But you're right, like this whole stepchild type of mentality is so true. So I guess, well, why don't we start there? Like, how do you determine what announcements are going to be happening from the stage?
So I think it's important that you start there, because if you don't start, if you don't have some sort of system in place to determine what gets announced and what doesn't get announced, then everything will get announced. And then you end up with something that only applies to a handful of people having the same importance, or at least it feels like it's the same importance as something that applies to the entire congregation. And so several years ago, we came up with a communication plan, a communication policy, in part because we were getting all of these requests from people that had really good things going on in the church, but we didn't feel like they were of the most value to the overall congregation. And so one of our goals with this process was to make sure that we were communicating first with a first time guest in mind. Like, if they hear this announcement, are they going to be able to understand what we're talking about, but also are they going to be able to take action on it? And then we also wanted to make sure that the most important things got the most important time. And so our we basically established a system, and it's based on the target audience. So we ask, if somebody requests for something to be communicated, we ask, does this apply to all or a majority of the audience? And basically, if it doesn't apply to a majority or a large group of the audience, then we don't announce it from the stage. So examples, like, does it apply to all the men or all the women or all the parents? You get the idea. If it's a large group of the audience, then we will communicate it. We also decided that we aren't going to announce birthdays or anniversaries or wedding showers or baby showers. We those things that are important for churches to kind of be a part of as far as community goes. We didn't feel like those needed to have the most important value, and also there were other avenues that those announcements could be communicated. And then we also decided, if it's an already established group of people, then we aren't going to make announcements for that group. So for instance, if it's a mission trip, a group that's already signed up to be a part of a mission trip, and you can't sign up any more people to go on the trip, we're not going to make announcements about that trip anymore, except for when we highlight what the Lord did at the end of the trip. So, like, we're not going to say, hey, if you're a part of the mission group, if you're going on the mission trip in 2 weeks, make sure you meet down front with Pastor so and so. We're not communicating that. It's up to the group leader to communicate to that already established group. So, like, small group events that are specific to a small group, we don't communicate those. Outings or get-togethers, we let the group leader communicate that however he or she wants to.
So how does
Yeah,
that
go ahead.
work when it comes? Yeah, so when it comes to like the teenagers, how does that work? So it's a big group of people potentially,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not, so how would you handle any events happening within the youth group?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question, because we want to communicate that there are things happening in the youth group with the teenagers, but we also don't want to alienate people that either don't have a teen or aren't involved in youth ministry in any way, because when you start talking about things that don't apply to them, they automatically tune out. And so we're trying to keep the audience's attention for the entire announcement segment. And so how we do it's very similar. If it's an already established group, the teens are going, to a movie outing, the youth pastor is responsible for communicating that to his group however he sees fit. Normally it's a text message, right? They use Remind, and he'll just text out whatever announcements he needs to send to the teenagers. If it's an opportunity for teens to sign up for something, then that would be where we would have an opportunity. But usually those opportunities for teens to sign up, we also include adults where they can sign up as well. So it's sort of it's sometimes you have to just take it case by case, as the announcement comes in, you have to decide, does this provide value or communicate one of our values, to the overall church? Or is it really like, we need 12 people to rake sister so-and-so's yard? We're probably not going to communicate that from this stage, because of the size of the church that we are. And also it'll be easier for us just to talk to one specific small group and go get the people to help to rake her yard. I will
So I
mention
guess
that. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say the same thing probably applies to like the kids ministry. Again, it's a big ministry. It probably involves a lot of people, volunteers, the kids
Yeah,
themselves, maybe even parents. So you might have a bigger event that's like a VBS, but then
right.
you also have some smaller things within the kids ministry. So
Mhm.
I guess unpack, how would you do some of the kids announcements as well?
Yeah, so kids announcements are similar to youth announcements. As opposed to, normally with kids, you have to communicate directly to the parent. With teenagers, you communicate to the teens and the parents. But with kids announcements, um, if it's something that we want the whole church to be involved in, like VBS you mentioned, then yes, by far we're gonna push that to everybody from the stage and encourage everybody to be involved. But if it's like kids joining the kids choir at the start of the semester, then that's something we'll communicate from the stage. But once that choir is already established, then we're not communicating the kids choir activities from then on. The only exception would be whenever they do a production. So they have a kids choir production. Obviously, that applies to the whole church. We want the whole church to be a part of the production, to come and watch and enjoy the production. So then we will bring the production or the kids choir event back up in front of the congregation. But from the time the signups are closed to the time the production happens, whatever happens in between, we're not communicating that from the stage. It's up to the kids choir director to communicate directly to the parents of the kids for
Okay.
those activities.
So, and I think I like what you were saying too. Like if it emphasizes like one of the values of the church, then
Yeah.
that's something you might want to try to figure out a way to communicate.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Even if
So
it
the
doesn't
only
affect that.
exception to those smaller or smaller audience announcements are if we are communicating a value or a mission of our church by communicating that event. So sometimes, like for instance, our kids, they did a missions project in the kids ministry where they put together some shoeboxes for homeless. And we communicated that event, not necessarily because we needed their help, the audience's help, but we wanted them to know that the kids were doing that event, that this is how the kids are on mission for, for God in our community. They're putting these shoe boxes together. So if it communicates an outreach event or a missions project, then we try to communicate all of those, because we want the whole church, even if we don't need them to sign up for it, we want them to know that we're actually on mission to, we're accomplishing our mission to impact people so they can experience a life-changing relationship with Jesus.
Very good. So how far out should we be announcing events?
So it depends on how many people you need for the event. That's one of the factors you have to determine. So the major events that we do: Easter, Christmas, VBS, Trunk or Treat. If you do a fall festival, something like that, we usually are communicating those about 6 weeks out. 6 weeks out, we'll start and we sort of highlight a different aspect of that event for 6 weeks. For every other event, it's between 3 and 4 weeks out. So the fourth week from the event, it's just a quick, hey, heads up, this is happening. Go ahead and get it on your calendars. We want you to be a part of it. And then the third week is like a little more explanation of the details. This is what's going on, and this is how you can be involved. 2 weeks out is sort of like the hard sell, the hard push. Hey, now's the time. You've been waiting. You've heard about it for a couple of weeks. Now's the time for you to take your next step and get involved in this. And then the last week is sort of like the last call. And typically, if it's something where we need a certain amount of volunteers for, we'll just communicate. We need 50 volunteers for this. We've got 40, so we need 10 of you to step up and be a part of this activity, this event. So that's typically 3 to 4 weeks is our typical process for communicating events.
Okay, yeah, that sounds good. So I don't know how you came up with that formula. In our world, we realize that people come to church. So we're in South Florida, Fort Lauderdale type area. So people on average, like on the fringes, they'll come to church once every 4 weeks, once every 6 weeks, maybe something along those lines. So we kind of decided that 4 weeks out for major events is probably going to catch them at least once, during a typical cycle. Of course, the regulars, they come more often, so they're going to hear it more often. But that's just kind of what we found out. So we've been going with this 4 week. Is there any input to why you chose 4 weeks out versus 3 or something different?
So I think you're right. A lot of people do attend less frequently. I'll just say, if you are relying solely on your verbal in-person announcements to communicate to your church, then you're probably missing at least half of them, because you may have communicated it from the stage, but for whatever reason they weren't there, or they weren't listening, or they were sick that day or whatever, or they were serving in kids ministry, so they didn't hear the announcement. So in-person announcements are important, but you can't put all your eggs in that basket. You've got to use the other avenues to communicate: email, social media, screens and slides, and of course word of mouth as well. So you've got to use those other avenues to help communicate the events.
That's great. So how do you tell somebody in the church that wants to announce something from the stage? How do you tell them no? Like, how does that conversation go?
Yeah, so we ran up into that before we established our communication policy. And by the way, I'd be happy to share that policy with you guys, like the full written out version, if that's helpful for your audience, Michael. You can put it in the show notes or whatever, and be happy to share that. But before we established that policy, we would get these just random requests from people who were doing good things, but maybe it was something that wasn't like totally sponsored by the church. It was sort of like a pet project of somebody, or something that only applied to just a handful of people. It's like, for one that I can think of, was a great ministry, and it was a great opportunity. But a lady in our church, she wanted to announce the Crisis Pregnancy Center fundraising event, because she wanted I think it was eight people to claim a ticket for a table that she had purchased. And so like it was a fundraising dinner, and she had 8 tickets, and she wanted people in the church to use one of those tickets to go to this crisis pregnancy fundraising dinner. That we support crisis pregnancy centers, we support that wholeheartedly, but it only applied to 8 people, and we didn't want to take up time communicating that specific event, because it was just a small group. And so before we established the policy, we pretty much either had to offend them, or we had to make the announcement, right? And typically our pastor would go ahead and make the announcement because he didn't want to offend anybody. So when we establish the policy, then Michael, if you're the one asking me to make an announcement about your dog's birthday party, I can say, without it being a personal attack towards you, I can say, hey, Michael, I'm sorry, we have a communication policy, and because that only applies to a certain amount of people, we can't communicate that from the stage where we aren't able to make those types of announcements anymore. So we're putting that back on the policy that was agreed to, that was communicated to all the key leaders, and all the key leaders had input in this. And so they had plenty of opportunity to speak into the process, and then we can just fall back on the policy if there's somebody who wants to communicate something that we don't want to.
That's good. That's good. I love that. So I think we've all been there and experienced that moment. What's you got to tell somebody no. What's the mindset behind the announcements? I guess before we move on, like, are we trying to communicate like what's going on, or like from your approach, are we trying to communicate a why, or there's a short amount of time? We'll talk about it later on, but like we don't want to spend a ton of time trying to announce things and all that stuff. But I guess what's the mindset going into it as you're thinking about announcements? Are you trying to inspire? Are you trying to do next steps? Like, what does that look like?
I would say, of those two, is do you want them to do something with it? Like, why are you communicating something unless you want the congregation to do something with what you're communicating? And so you want them to take it as a step. I think every announcement should have some sort of call to action where you're asking them to respond in some way to whatever it is that you just announced. I mean,
so
occasionally
are you trying to communicate? I was going to say with that, the call to action, are you trying to tap into the why a little? I guess I do announcements from time to time. So one of the things that I don't want people to miss is like, it's not just like, hey, we're doing this thing, we have this harvest party, but how can we point back to the why or to a value or something along those lines? So I try to communicate that very briefly, like there's not a lot of time.
Yeah.
So it's like pointing back to the why behind the what, or at least hinting at it as much as possible.
Yes, I mean, definitely you should. There are some announcements where it's just is a what, like you're just communicating the what. But if it's something that's like outreach related or something that's tied to your mission, then you should don't assume that they understand what the why is. You should communicate the why. We're going to minister to the homeless because, like, give them the why, not just the what. So yeah, I do think that that's an important part of it.
One of the other things I found to be helpful is that mindset of like, we don't want something from you, we want something for you. So even like just trying to communicate something from that perspective, like even if hey, we're doing a drive to bring coats or something like that, but we want something for you. Like we want to give you an opportunity to be generous, or we want to give your family an opportunity to make an impact in the city, or something like that. It helps me to kind of communicate that. And then the call to action is, okay, bring your coats in 3 weeks. By the way, that doesn't happen in South Florida. That was a bad example.
Yeah.
We don't need the coats.
Right. No, but I get what you're saying. I think that's really helpful to try to encourage them. There are some things you do just because God has commanded us to do it, but there are also things that you go to bless someone, but in return you receive, or at least you feel like you received more of a blessing by being the giver. Jesus said it's more blessed to give than to receive. So yeah, I think that's good.
So let's talk about the people who do the announcements. How do we find the right people? What are some of the qualifications or even some of the training? I've been through this from time to time with different churches I've been at. Not everybody is good at this.
Sure.
Some people, they just talk too much. Some people, they don't communicate or come across friendly, or it's kind of robotic. They don't have a good vibe for it. There's other people that are great. They connect. They can throw a joke in there and it works really well, and you just feel
Hmm.
good, after they're done. Even though they're announcing things, they still make you feel good. I
Hmm.
guess what are your thoughts as far as like how do you find the right people?
So if you are if you're able to make these types of decisions, one of the very first things you should ask is, are they coachable? Like if you're approaching someone about being a host for your services, ask, are they coachable? Because no matter how much experience they have, you need to be able to give them some feedback on how they can improve. And so if they're humble, if they're coachable, if they're willing to learn, I think pretty much anybody could be a host and do a good job. Um, it doesn't have to be somebody who's a professional speaker, or even a staff member. We typically always use staff members because it gives an opportunity for staff members who aren't on stage every week to have um, some time in front of the audience, in front of the congregation. But you could use, just a regular lay leader, a small group leader, or something like that, if they're willing to learn, willing to accept some constructive criticism and get some feedback.
That's good. I think with our situation, we don't have any staff.
Okay.
We're a church that's 3 years old, and
Uh-huh.
so we found some people that um, have a good connection, or they're good speaking, in front of people. So
Hmm.
we've kind of targeted specifically, a few people that we feel would do well.
Hmm.
We've also tried to do a rotation, and I'm not sure. Again, we try to do a rotation of like um, a few different faces, just to be kind of representational of the people that are in the
Sure.
congregation.
Hmm.
So, like, we'll
Yeah.
we'll, we'll try to have a lady do announcements, or I might do announcements, or somebody else. I don't know. We try to kind of have a
Hmm.
good kind of crossroads. Somebody younger, I'm in my
Hmm.
40s, so I'm getting older now. So maybe somebody younger will do it for. And then
Right.
what I've also found too, and this is just might be a personal thing, but I like doing it 2 weeks in a row.
Mm.
So I find it like if I kind of build a little bit of momentum from one week to the next, it kind of helps me kind of get locked in. So it's just, again, that's just kind of one of the things I like to do.
Hmm.
But the coachability thing for sure is huge. But I think what we've tried to find is as well are people that are just um, natural as far as like being able to communicate something and have that kind of
Hmm.
likability
Hmm.
from the stage.
Hmm.
Um, so that when people watch it and they're viewing the announcements, they are getting information, but at the same time, it's kind of easy to digest. So
Hmm. I think it's good to have a rotation of people if you have people that you can trust and that can communicate well. It's helpful. I would say even if you do have a rotation, you should still have a consistent formula or framework that you use and you encourage them to use so that the quality of the announcement time does not dip from week to week depending on just their personality or just their ability to deliver. Obviously
yeah,
there's some
I
skill that they need, but everybody can learn. But if you have a framework, then everybody can follow the framework and of course inject their own personality into the framework. You don't want to, it's not a stiff rote, you're reading off the script. But you want the quality and the what is communicated to be consistent from week to week, no matter who's on stage.
Yeah, we just a funny story. We had somebody doing announcements, and they were so our church, our brand, we target new believers, people that are new to the
Hmm.
faith.
Sure.
So a lot of what we do is towards that. So we when we do announcements, we want to make sure we unpack things in a way that somebody that's new to church and doesn't
Hmm.
understand church would understand it. In South Florida, 97% of people don't come to church, so that's kind of our vibe.
Yeah.
So one of the people doing announcements, they had mentioned in one of the announcements, and I forgot the context, but they mentioned the oil of Gilead in the announcements. And
Uh-huh.
I know that's like a Bible reference, but I've
Right.
been in church all my life, and I can't think of like where that came from.
Uh-huh.
But it was like super insider, you know,
Right.
churchy type thing.
Yeah.
Or somebody else might have said we're gonna send Judah first. Let's go back into praise and worship right now, and you know
Uh-huh.
So we've had some of those things kind of happen in the past, and we've had to coach, hey, listen, we want to make sure we're using language that's everybody can understand in the room. So that coachability thing is huge. And,
Yeah.
Anyway, it's just a funny story to emphasize what we're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's where it's important, especially if you have somebody new, ask them to write out their announcement segment, like just script it out, and then you can review it if you're leading, if you're responsible for it, you can review it and then give them feedback before they actually present it. Like don't wait for them to present it and then you have to go and correct something, like sort of do a trial run or a couple of trial runs, and that way they know what you're expecting, and they also can they're not using those acronyms or insider language or language that somebody who is not a part of the church doesn't understand.
So you're talking about a formula or a framework that you've established,
Hmm.
and you're sending out like announcements earlier in the week, right? So whoever's
Hmm.
up will get it in advance. Why don't you
Hmm.
walk through your process and the formula?
Yeah. So as my role at the church, I'm responsible for what's communicated. And so usually it's on Thursday. I will look ahead to see what's sort of coming up, what needs to be communicated based off of our policy, and then I will write some bullet points, and I actually send it to all of our staff just so everybody's aware about what's going to be communicated. But I send it to the person, the host, and basically all they have to do is just follow the framework. And so the framework is really simple. It's always introduction. You should always introduce yourself. Like, don't just get up there and start talking, because you're trying to think of this through the lens of a first time guest, somebody who's never been to your church or maybe never been to any church. So try to communicate as clearly as you can to that person. And so even though 95% of the people in our church, they know who I am, every time I get up, hey everybody, it's so great to see you. My name's Joshua. I'm one of the pastors here. I say that every time I get on stage. And so you introduce yourself, then you always welcome everyone, especially if it's somebody's first time. We try not to use the word guest because guest sort of implies that they might not come back, like they're only there temporarily. We try to use the word first time. If this is your first time here, I usually say, if this is your first time here or your first time back in a while, we want to say a special welcome to you. Then we go to connection card, and the connection card for us is uh, there's a physical and digital version, so they can use the physical card or digital card. And it's not just for first time guests because it has prayer requests. So we encourage everyone, if they have a prayer request, a prayer need, they can put it on the card, and we promise to pray for them throughout the week over that prayer request. So it's intro, welcome. I forgot to mention we also be sure to welcome those watching online at that time.
Oh
So it's
yeah.
not just those in the room, but anybody who's joining us online, we welcome them. And then it's connection card. And then it's leading into whatever announcements need to be communicated. We typically will start with the announcement that is the farthest away. So if it's a 4 week out or 3 week out announcement, we'll do that first, because we want the last announcement. That's going to be the most important thing that we're trying to communicate for that day. So if we're doing 3 announcements, and I recommend no more than 3. We didn't really talk about that, but if you've got 12 announcements, they're not going to remember anything. So you can think of it like bowling balls. This is from Donald Miller. Some of you probably know him and his story brand framework, but he basically says every time you give a big idea or a big thought in communicating, you're handing them a bowling ball and you want them to hold the bowling ball. So you give them 2 bowling balls. They can hold 3 bowling balls. They can like manage it. But when you hand them the fourth bowling ball, they're going to drop all of them. And so they're not going to remember anything. So if you have 5, 6, 12 announcements, most of what you're communicating is not going to land. It's going to fall on deaf ears. So that's the tip. So 3 announcements, the one that's furthest out first, and then the next one, and then the most important one we save. And then that last one, we usually try to tie a story into that announcement. So either something that we've
Love
done in the
that.
past, like how this event, what we did last year, how it impacted someone, or some sort of missions outreach, or something that we're doing as a church. We try to tie that into the last announcement if possible, and then we go into offering and a prayer. So how they can give. And remember, we're talking to first time guests. So I try to always say, if this is your first time here, we do not expect you to give, because that's a hurdle for some people for coming to church. They think the church just wants their money. So we try to address that up front, right out of the gate. We're not expecting you to give if this is your first time. I usually say we do give our regular attenders an opportunity to give as the Lord directs them. But if it's your first time, we don't expect you to give today. So then I explain how they can give and then pray before the pastor comes for the sermon. So that's pretty much our framework. And so I outline that, send it off to whoever the host is. They get it on Thursday, so they have a couple of days to prepare, and then they deliver on Sunday.
So couple quick hitters. We'll start to wrap up this part of the topic here, but
Yeah.
a couple quick hitters that I'd love to throw your way and see what your thoughts are.
Mm-hmm.
Number one, so I don't know what your flow of service looks like, but if you're asking people to sit down, or you're kind of transitioning to where they're standing to sitting, how do you do that? Do you do like, hey, give somebody a high five, greet somebody, or do you just tell them to sit down? Just quick thought on that.
Okay, so so we don't ask people to like turn around and greet and hug and all that. That sort of that we stopped doing that well before COVID. But for everything in our service, again, we're thinking through the lens of a first time guest. And if you haven't been to church for the first time in a while, like I encourage you to go visit a church, but not a church that's in your denomination. Go visit a church that's in a different denomination or even a different faith altogether. Just visit and make note of how you feel. It's awkward. It feels weird. So if you're asking somebody to give me a hug and I have never met you before, some people may love that. I don't love that. Most people probably don't love that. So we don't say turn around, and every now and then, I mean, maybe once every 2 years or something, I'll say, give somebody a high five and tell them you're glad to see them. So, but it's extremely rare because we're always thinking through the lens of a first time guest. So if I'm getting them to sit down, so we stand for worship pretty much the whole time. At the end of the worship set, I typically will say something like, thanks so much for singing and worshiping with us today. You guys can be seated. And then they sit down, and then we move on to the next thing. So that's
good.
Our typical flow.
Yeah, we're similar. Our church is a little. We do the high five, so we feel like it's, and then it's have a seat, and then also during that time is typically when we're transitioning into the announcements and all that stuff. So we might do a greeting to the online audience.
Yeah.
So something like, hey, give somebody a high five before you sit down. Hey, welcome to everybody joining us online. We're so glad you're here. My name is Michael, and then we go.
Yeah.
Into that.
Yeah, high five, fist bump. I think that's cool. If you're talking about hug and like this, I mean, I've seen churches where they'll have a 4 or 5 minute greeting time, and that does work for a certain size congregation. Another thing that I'll send you, Michael, that you can use in your show notes is Tim Keller's communication plan based on church size. It is gold. And basically he says, as your church grows, you have to change the way you communicate. And so, and one of those things is, do you ask people to greet during the service or not? And so depending on your size will determine what decision you make.
Awesome. I love it. So we'll got some really good resources in the show notes. So make sure you check that out. Okay. The other one, bulletins. What do you think? What are your thoughts on bulletins? Should we be doing them?
So I am not a fan of bulletins. I think they could work in certain situations, but the question to ask is the amount of time that we're spending to produce this and money. Is it getting a return based on the amount of time? So if you have an admin or secretary or someone is spending, 6 or 8 hours a week and you're paying, $60 a week to print your bulletins, like that, just the amount of time and the resources that you're using to produce that is significant. And so you've got to ask, is this producing enough value for the amount of time and money that we're spending on it? I think that's you got to decide that. And if you can justify it, then go for it. But in today's day with the digital age, I don't think there's a need for a bulletin because there are other ways to communicate what you're trying to communicate to your audience.
Yeah, make sure you check out part 2 of this because we'll talk about what that might look like.
Yeah.
And then the final question I had is video announcements. What are your thoughts? Live announcements versus video announcements?
Video announcements, I would put in the same similar category as far as deciding when to do them as bulletin. Is the time that you're spending on it, is it producing enough value for the time and the resources that you're spending? If you have somebody who can do it well, and they can do it relatively quickly, then I think it's a great resource because you can really hone in exactly what you want to communicate, and you also can use that video in other, like on social media and other ways. Um, we did video announcements for probably 5 years, and I was responsible for it. I would record pretty much every week. We would record announcement segment. I was spending between 5 and 8 hours a week on this 2.5 minute commercial. And I had an admin at the time, and she would help. She did some of it, and so that was helpful. But then she transitioned, and when she transitioned, I just told our team, I don't think I can spend 8 hours every week. I don't think this is providing enough value for me to spend 8 hours every week to produce this commercial. And so that's when we went to in person. We established the framework, and we went to in-person announcements going forward.
So good. All right. So we talked about a lot.
Yeah.
Before we close it out, any final thoughts about the strategy when it comes to announcements?
Think of your audience, and always think of the first-time guests. Like, first-timer, you want to make sure you can communicate whatever you're communicating. They need to be able to understand it, and they need to be able to take action. And if it applies to a majority of the congregation, then communicate it, especially if it's tied to your mission or vision. If it doesn't, then use a different channel, a different avenue to communicate those events.
Excellent. Hey, Josh, I love the way you think and the way you unpack this whole process that every church has to figure out. It is kind of the stepchild, but I think one of the things we talked about leading into all this episode, kind of our pre-conversation, is that it can really enhance the service experience. Like if you're thinking about it with the right mindset, then it can really enhance the things you value as a church. It can add value to people, and it doesn't have to be a stepchild. It can be something that becomes a really great part of the service experience from week to week.
Yeah.
So this is the episode on our strategies. We will have another episode coming up. Josh, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Hey, thanks, Michael. And if I can help you guys, don't hesitate to shoot me an email. It's just joshua@worshipresources.church. So if you have questions about any of this, I'd love to chat with you about it. joshua@worshipresources.church.
That's perfect. Yep. Check that out. And thanks again, Joshua. Appreciate you being on the podcast. Thanks for listening today. Remember, this is part 1 of 2 episodes that we have when it comes to announcements. If you like this episode, if you like the podcast, if this is helpful to you, I would love for you to subscribe both on YouTube, also as a podcast on your favorite podcast player. That just helps get the word out. Leave a review if you can. That'd be great. Again, it just helps to get the word out to help more and more churches just like yours to do this really well. Again, our goal is to help you as a communications director at your church, whatever that looks like, whatever your title looks like. You might be volunteering, you might be a pastor that's doing everything, but we just want to help you to win. Make sure you check out churchbrandguide.com for great resources. We have a free download that's going to help you when it comes to like branding your church. And we have a lot of different episodes as well, even examples from churches that we have worked with, that we built websites or logos or any of those type of things that'll just help to inspire you. So check out that great resource at churchbrandguide.com. There's also a way for you to reach out if you want to work with me directly or have me work directly with your church to help you create some of these systems and branding elements. So check that out as well. churchbrandguide.com. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you on the next episode.